My name is Sara Smith. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a professor of history at American River College, and today's date is May 22nd, 2023. So let's start off by establishing some of the basics. What's your full name? What are your pronouns? And what's your date of birth?
My name is Allan Gaither. My pronouns are he, him, and my date of birth is June 13th, 2003.
So tell me a little about yourself. What are your interests and hobbies? What do you like to do?
I enjoy illustration. I do a lot of digital and traditional commission work. I think it's fun. I also do storyboarding for animatics and animations in my free time. It's a pretty fun hobby.
Where did you grow up and where do you live now?
Well, I have moved around a little bit, but I've spent most of my childhood in California, in Sacramento. I did briefly live in Iowa, Mount Vernon, Iowa, but I've spent most of my time here.
Where in Sacramento?
Around the Carmichael area. Right now I'm living in East Sac on my own.
Where do you currently attend college and what do you study?
Well, right now I'm enrolled in American River College and Sacramento City College, and I'm just currently about to finish 2 associates in the individual and society as well as social sciences. I'm also enrolled in and about to start school at Portland State University for a undergrad in biological psychology.
So can you tell me about your identities, broadly speaking, your social identities?
Well, I am autistic. I found that out a little bit ago. I identify as trans and butch. People talk a lot about how there's an intersection between the butch identities and the trans man experience, and I feel like I fit pretty squarely in that intersection.
Can you elaborate a little bit about what you mean?
It is difficult to, because those things mean different things for each person who hears them and each person who says them. So I am still personally trying to figure out the most precise way to explain that, but it's not easy. My experience with gender and sexuality is impacted by my autism in that gender is a set of constructs that people ascribe into certain labels or certain identities and how they interact with them. And when your fundamental understanding of social interaction and social sort of circumstances and applications is different than what is typical, it's more difficult, at least in my experience, to fit into ascribed labels or boxes. I have a difficult time assessing how I fit regarding where I identify. I don't really relate to cis men very much. I don't really identify as a man, but it wouldn't be inaccurate either. I don't identify as a woman, but I am comfortable in the label butch, because I feel like that specific experience speaks to how I feel. Yeah.
So is there anything else you'd like to say with regard to your social identities? Sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, immigration?
I grew up upper middle class. My mom works for the state, so I was privileged in having health care that provides for my transition from a young age. Not a whole lot else to say on that area, but it has definitely played a part in my trans and queer experience.
Is there anything you want to say, else you feel like you could say about what trans masculinity means to you? Or do you...
It's one of those things that's very difficult to define for me.
Okay.
Because what is and is not masculine is subjective and decided by the person who is using that label, and to each individual person, to every cis man, being a cis man means something different. And so, because there is no defined criteria, it's difficult for me to create one for myself. I am most comfortable in masculinity, how I feel it, but conveying that to a listening audience is difficult in terms of like what makes that such and not, say, a feminine experience. I guess it's what Yeah, I have a lot of difficulty with that. I identify with masculinity more than I do with femininity, and I only know that because I get a sense of gender dysphoria that tipped me off. Uh, Not that that applies to everyone, but yeah.
Would you distinguish your trans masculinity from cis masculinity more broadly?
I think there's intersection to be found for sure. All I know is that I don't really relate to what has been described to me as cis male experience. That being said, I'm 19 and I haven't met a whole lot of people in my life yet, and maybe I will align more when I have more option with who I'm surrounded with. Maybe those experiences will align more with how I see myself as well. Maybe they won't. I feel a certain solidarity with women in that I've been through a lot of things that women have been through. I've experienced sexism targeted at me as though I were a woman. I've experienced life from that perspective, or at least one of those perspectives to be had. And I don't think that can be found, at least not as easily, in a cis male experience. That being said, I don't identify as a woman. I don't engage with the world the way that that experience has been explained to me as pertaining to engagement with the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So what was the process like of figuring out your identity?
Quite difficult. Well, around middle school, all of my friends were queer, and I was like, maybe that means something. And so I think I first came out as a lesbian, because women are pretty cool. I'm asexual, so I don't really get that indicator. I don't have sexual attraction, but I've been romantically interested in gals since I was young. And then I came out as bi because I realized that actually dudes are pretty cute. I identified as trans first when I was about, 13 or 14. Well, when I was very young, I realized that something was off and that it would be a problem for later. And that caught up with me around middle school when I realized that I just don't relate to or feel comfortable with how I'm being perceived by those around me. And I didn't really understand non-binary outside of the idea that when people hear the word non-binary, they think of a specific thing, and so did I. I didn't have a grasp of what non-binary meant other than a specific androgyny that is idealized in certain communities. And so I identified as a binary trans man or trans boy or however you'd like to phrase that up until, about 16. When it started really hitting that I just don't relate to that experience very much. And I had, by that point, made friends who were also not binary. And hearing them talk about how they engage with gender as a concept really opened up how I engage with gender as a concept. And it let me sort of pick and choose things that I do and don't relate to and organize from there, as opposed to finding the example of what it means to be a woman or a man and relating or not relating to it.
Oh, is there anything else you'd like to add about what it was like figuring out your identity, identities?
I mentioned earlier that because of my mom's job with the state, I had access to healthcare from a very young age. I'm very grateful for that. It made things a lot easier. My parents were not unaccepting, but not enthusiastic either, if you know what I mean. I'm glad to have been in that position and not when I've heard those of my friends that have been a lot more rocky. It was a little rough to start. I started therapy when I was about 14, and my therapist, I got very lucky, was very good and talked to my parents on my behalf about what it means to be trans and hey, this is okay, and these things, transitioning socially, medically, could be helpful and won't cause irreparable damage, things like that. And they steadily opened up more and more. Yeah.
So as time went on, where did you find affirmation and support?
In my friends, in my therapist, in my father. He's always tried his best. Yeah. I have not had a whole lot of community. Being autistic and not knowing it in your childhood isolates you very much. So I found more comfort than I wish I had in internet communities. Yeah, I don't think that's been necessarily harmful, but it certainly hasn't been productive to learning how to socialize with people.
So did religion play a role in your life growing up?
So when I lived in Iowa, I was a part of the Latter-day Saints. I don't personally recommend being queer and among the Latter-day Saints. I was lucky in that I was able to leave to move to California from Iowa before I realized that I was trans. And while it took quite some time to sort of deprogram and to unlearn some of the things that I had picked up in that church, I was able to. I moved to California around 3rd grade, so I've had a lot of time to learn comfort in myself.
Do you think the fact that you grew up in the Church of Latter-day Saints, that influenced you as you were coming out and figuring out your identity?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Sorry to cut you off there. Yeah, no, for sure. My mother is, well, she grew up in more conservative areas, and so she grew up in the church, and there is definitely a lot of don't talk about it attitude about a lot of things. Not by intention, but just sort of it's built into the culture. And so growing up, while they had voiced before when I was younger that if one of me or my siblings ended up being LGBTQ, it would be okay. I had that and I was reassured by that, but even hearing that as a kid, there was a sense of guilt and, I couldn't, no. That took a long time to sort of work over. It was very difficult coming out to myself as a kid because even being 11 or so, it's very ingrained that that's not an option. That's not really, even if it's outwardly spoken as we can accept, we can tolerate, and even in my family it was that would be okay. It doesn't feel that way. It's very ingrained in the culture of Mormonism not to be queer. Yeah, so it took a while to get over that. And I got out early, too. Yeah.
So are you religious now? Is your family religious?
My family's not currently affiliated with the church. My grandmother is still in the church and will tell them our address every time we move, so I do occasionally see Mormons. And that's okay. I do think that some of the more abstract parts of the culture that aren't strictly tied to what is preached, just the sort of attitudes, have settled in places in our lives that it would take examination to get rid of. And while I have done an examination, it's a long conversation that I haven't had yet with my family.
So in the questionnaire you mentioned, and at the start of this interview, you mentioned that you're autistic.
Yes.
You also mentioned in the questionnaire that you have persistent depressive disorder.
Yes.
Is there anything you want to elaborate on either of those? What does it mean for you to be autistic and to have persistent depressive disorder?
Sure. Yeah, well, the way that ended up working out is there's an interesting sort of cognitive dissonance in my family where both of my parents are psychologists and fairly accomplished, and neither of them could really come to the conclusion that I might be a little off until into my adult life. I actually only got my diagnosis after I moved out. And growing up as a kid with autism and having that disconnect between yourself and your peers your entire life and not knowing why is an incredibly isolating experience. I do think that is a big reason, having that sort of off feeling and being made fun of and not understanding sort of that you are being made fun of or why, it instills depression. It instills mental ailment. I cannot remember the source, but I remember someone saying at one point, or seeing a quote, that depression and anxiety are not inherent in like transness and queerness, in autism or neurodiverse or certain neurological disorders like autism, but you can't have a person of those identities who does not grow up with some sort of mental illness because of how that experience is and it impacts you growing up. I don't know if that's necessarily strictly true. I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but I have found it to be a very accurate statement in my life and the lives of my friends. Yeah.
So, what was the process like figuring out that you were autistic?
Well, I really liked Star Trek as a kid. And I saw Spock and I went, that one. And I don't know, just seeing other representations of characters in media and going, I relate to that experience. It's very specific, and a lot of people are saying that one's autistic, so maybe I should examine that. And then both of my parents are psychologists, so I had a lot of interest in psychology and neurofunction and just how that works. And so doing research for hours, just hyperfixating, if you will, on the topic. And then I was in therapy from 14, and I'm still seeing the same therapist, though it's been on and off now. And I remember a couple years ago when I was 18, and I was just about to move out, I had just recently reconnected with the same therapist that I had been seeing from 14 to about 15. And she said, well, Allan, I didn't want to bring this up because you were going through a lot and you were trying to transition, and something like an autism diagnosis can be very difficult when you're trying to transition, but you are autistic. Yeah, you have autism, and it's not a bad thing, don't worry. And I was very relieved to hear that, because I had spent a lot of time talking to my parents about how I think I'm different, or autistic specifically, and just being shut down consistently every single time. And so to have a professional go, hey, by the way, there's something going on, was very validating. It shed light on a lot of difficulties I've had in middle school, high school, just growing up generally, and disconnecting from people my age and what they're going through, and not having that sort of sense of relatability with really anyone other than my other autistic friends. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about how your family responded, but is there anything else you want to say? Like, how did they respond when you told them that you have a diagnosis, that you know that you're autistic?
Not too poorly. Certain things felt strained, but it was kind of a, well, I've received an updated information and now I'll work off that. Cool. You know, my dad has always been really supportive, and I'm really glad to have him as a father, even though it's been difficult to find these grounds. It's been difficult to explain myself in a way that is understood mutually and have my needs met in these areas. Once things have been sort of confirmed or established and we have a mutual understanding, he's always been very supportive. And even getting up to that point, it's been earnest and not... Experience sometimes has not been validated by speaking with my parents. Often it has not. But that's never been their intention, and intention means a lot. Their intention has consistently been positive.
So how does it feel to have figured out your the fact that you're autistic?
Relieving. Again, it contextualizes a lot of my life. A lot of my interactions, a lot of how I navigate and experience the world, why certain shirts I straight up can't wear, why in classrooms I'd be in a disassociative episode for hours because it was a little too loud. These things make sense now. It's a little relieving.
Can you tell me about your experience being both queer and autistic?
Oh, I think one informs the other, definitely. not every autistic person is queer, and not every queer person is autistic, but I think that when you're talking about things defined by social experiences, and then you have a cognitive disorder that informs how you experience social experiences, they tend to be intertwined. I mentioned earlier that I think that a lot of my gender identity is impacted by how I do and don't relate to how others experience gender. And I think sexuality plays a part in that as well. I don't have sexual attraction, so I never really got the indicator of, hey, you find that person hot, there's your sexuality. There's a romantic orientation. You don't really have to... Well, I'd be making assumptions. But I didn't really have that indicator, so I kind of had to figure out who I experienced romantic feelings for and how that's informed. Is it informed by their presentation? Is it informed by that I've gotten to know them for a long time, that I haven't? Things like that. I don't know if that's... I do know that there is a large percentage of autistic people who are aromantic and asexual. I don't know how tied those are, but I will get back to you in 6 years when I have a degree in that specifically.
Is that what you're planning on getting a degree in?
Yeah, biopsychology. I plan on studying specifically how the brain physically is different in neurodiversity and different forms of neurodiversity. And then I would love to study specifically, autism. It's a personal interest as it has impacted me quite a bit. And I don't know if I do much research into sexuality, but yeah, these areas generally are my very big interests in my educational path. I'd like to study how the brain works through a psychological perspective, but not exclusively a cognitive frame, like a biological frame as well. But circling back to the question a little bit, yes, I think being autistic has informed my experience as a trans person, as a person generally, and in terms of sexuality as well, where when you're not binary and you don't understand really how binaries in regards to gender function entirely outside of the sort of semantic social circles, the labels you use, like gay or lesbian or bisexual, are impacted as well, because if you use lesbian as a term to describe specifically women, attracted to specifically women, there's that section of thought. There's also women and people who identify as around the area of femininity, attracted to people around the area of femininity as well as women. And then you have to ask, okay, so what defines that area of femininity? And then where do butch identities come into that? And where do masculine identities intersect? And at what point does that corrode and no longer fit within that group? An identity label. When are you no longer a part of that social group, but sitting in on it? You know, and finding these definitions, there's no right answer that I've found, and there's no wrong answer either, but it's been very difficult trying to figure that out. Which is why I tend to say that I'm functionally bisexual. I am attracted to, I have been in the past and probably will in the future be attracted romantically to people of both and all sorts of different gender identities. But it makes it very difficult to find solidarity in a community that is so, at least in my experience as having grown up online, very categorized. It very much makes me want to talk to queer people in real life and people who are older in the community than I am. It's a resource that is hard to come by, but especially on the West Coast, I look forward to being able to interface with people in person who have more lived experience and less definitional experience.
How would you distinguish romantic attraction from sexual attraction in your own experiences?
In my own experiences, because that's a good addition, because so many people have so many different ways of describing that. For me, I just don't experience physical or mental arousal by people's bodies. I don't see someone and get sort of the indicator that that person is hot. I do find people aesthetically attractive, but in the same way you could find a sculpture or a painting of a really cool tree aesthetically attractive, you know? When it comes to romantic attraction, it's also a bit difficult. It's not very frequent or common for me either. If I know someone for a long time and I find that Um, it's difficult to describe because I've had friends where I'm very invested in them specifically and personally and emotionally. And I've also had relationships where I'm interested in that person and in who they are and their goals and their aspirations. And these two experiences are not so different, but it feels slightly different. I've been in queer platonic relationships where there is an identification that our relationship is just as dedicated and just as meaningful as any romantic relationship, but there isn't that specific feeling of romantic attraction. Defining romantic attraction is something that I think if we could do, a lot more people would be a lot more clear on where they lay in aromanticism. I think you could identify me as gray romantic if you want. I have kind of given up trying to find a specific label in that community just because a friend once put it that every person he talked to who's ace or aro has a completely different way of explaining it, and I tend to agree. There's no wrong way to identify in those groups, to feel those experiences. I just haven't found a label that is consistent to my identity, but that could be because identity is never consistent. It's always fluid, and it's often informed by the people around me. Yeah.
So you talked about this some already, but is there anything else you feel like you could say about what gender feels like to you, like how gender is shaped by being autistic?
I think it's very informed by the people I'm around at the moment, the media I'm engaging with at the moment. It's kind of weird to explain. It's difficult to convey in a way that sounds solid, but I've got certain friends where when I hang out with them, I feel more masculine. I feel more on the side of closer to a binary identity. And I've got friends who I feel closer to what I describe myself as butch, where I'm not a man, but I'm also not a woman, and I do identify more with masculine experiences. I present pretty masc. It's just something that's so individualized that it's hard to come up with a good identifier for. But there's also that when I have interacted with and engaged with butch women, there's that same feeling of, oh yeah, I get that a little bit in my own way. I align with that to a degree. And yeah, so I think some of that probably has to do with the autism of just sort of, I don't really understand certain social structures when they're in a vacuum because they seem so informed by people and by people's experiences. So when I'm engaging with different people and different experiences and different settings, my sort of identity tends to like fluctuate to fit, not to fit or ascribe to anything, but sort of it modifies myself in regards to whatever situation I'm in. I won't identify more closely to womanhood because I'm around women, but maybe I've got a specific friend who, the way we engage, the way we talk, the things we relate about will shift my sort of understanding of myself in that moment to be more along that area. I'm more consistently masculine in my experience, whatever that means, which is why I have pursued transition. I mean, it's among reasons. I really like physically where I'm at. I've been on testosterone since I was about 15, and I consistently like what it's done. So, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't identify at all with gender that is not ascribed to this body type, you know? Yeah, it's all subjective.
So how have you been treated as somebody who is autistic and queer?
Not well. Yeah, I mean, growing up, there was a lot of mockery that I did not recognize as such. You're different and you behave different, and kids, at least like where I grew up culturally, are taught not to treat people too well when they're those things, when they're abnormal, in any regards. You know, if you're not white and skinny and happy, then it's a problem. So, neurotypical, straight, cis. The list goes on. And I was not neurotypical, and I was not cis, and I was not straight, and I wasn't particularly skinny. I do have white privilege, and that has granted me social interactions that would have been a lot more difficult otherwise. But growing up with autism, being autistic, and not understanding really what people mean when they say certain things, or what like certain facial expressions mean, or why they responded to what you said so strongly, even though it's a sentence you've heard before and even used before and it's been like fine, is really alienating. And then you get mocked a lot for like, I had vocal tics as a kid. Clearing my throat was like a big one. And I didn't know why I had to do it so much, because I didn't know I was autistic. And certainly other people didn't know I had to do it so much. And it was not very favored, especially, and to a degree I understand when you're taking a test and the kid next to you keeps clearing the throat every 30 seconds, it can get pretty annoying. But it wasn't very productive how people around my age, and even adults, would respond to that. I was very much treated as a problem rather than having difficulties and problems to be addressed and helped, you know? Then when it comes to being queer, I was lucky enough that I found out that I was queer after I left the Midwest. I don't know how that would go then. I have family friends who are queer still living in Iowa, and it's not something that's impossible. There aren't not queer people outside of California. But it would have been more difficult, I think. It would have been a lot more difficult if I'd stayed in the Mormon church. I'm sure you can imagine. I have experienced harassment and discrimination from adults and children alike from the earliest I can remember is probably about 13 or 12. And that includes staff, and that includes fellow students. That includes situations that I felt could have gotten violent, and that includes situations that were mundane microaggressions that they didn't even know they were doing. It varies, and that's... And again, I have, like, privilege as well. I'm coming at this and having these experiences still, these difficult experiences, from a place of upper middle class, from a place of being white. I have no idea how much worse it would have been or how different it would have been in other experiences, you know? The fact that it's been this difficult with the privileges I've been allotted in life is, it tells you about just the climate, you know? I don't know if I'm phrasing that very well, but...
Can you think of anything specific, any specific incidences?
Oh, I mean, there's countless. I remember in high school being confronted by people in the bathroom, you know, just the show me your dick kind of things. Things that could have gotten a lot worse, but I got lucky and got out of them. I remember in middle school having adults approach my friends and demand their dead name. Just really, like, hammer down on it. There's a lot of things. Those are some of the more rough, and I'm very lucky in that it hasn't escalated further. But you just circumstances like that, a lot of dead naming, a lot of harassment. Nothing that any other queer person couldn't tell you.
Did you have teachers in high school that were supportive, that you could count on to, you know, deal with a student who was harassing you, or, you know?
I had a lot of teachers who I think had good, positive intentions, who just didn't know how to handle this sort of situation. I didn't really, it never escalated to the point where I felt that I would have grounds to report with other students. Just because it was isolated incidents, I didn't have names, it was in passing type things. I have reported adults at my high school for inappropriate and offensive behavior multiple times. Students would actually go to see, one of the benefits of autism is that I don't get a lot of the social pressure that a lot of people do when it comes to conformity, when it comes to I shouldn't say anything because it might upset someone, or I shouldn't say anything because no one else is. I don't get as much of that, so people knew this and they'd go to me with issues they'd be having with teachers, and I would report the teachers to a principal, to faculty, to administration, and I've had to do that a couple times.
So at ARC, you said you're mainly a student at ARC, but you are taking one online class at SCC, right?
Yes.
Do you think the colleges have provided adequate support and accommodations for you as somebody who's autistic?
Honestly, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't expect to be as well accommodated. I had to fight tooth and nail for accommodations in high school. It was very, very difficult to get accommodations in high school, and I showed up to ARC. And I went to the DSPS after like half a year of struggling really hard. And I quickly got accommodations. I got extensions on time for exams. I got the option to take exams in different rooms. They have a lot to offer. I have had a lot of counseling appointments that I likely would not have been able to book otherwise. Being able to schedule classes ahead of time in order to priority registration in order to make sure that my classes align with my work life and my home life in a way that accommodates my disability it has meant a lot.
What about faculty? Have you found accommodations in the classroom?
I've had professors who are definitely willing to give me extensions because I've been having difficulty keeping up with coursework because of how my brain processes information. When it comes to being queer as well, I have had mostly positive experiences with ARC staff. It's my experience at ARC has been fairly accommodative.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything you'd like to see ARC do better when it comes to accommodating and supporting autistic students, or if you have any thoughts about students with disabilities more generally?
Well, I did take an adapted PE course that, while it is absolutely critical and useful for a lot of the students who were there, it just did not line up with how I experienced disability. There are certain things that just kind of goes into the model of not the model, the acknowledgement of there's no one model for every experience, right? I do not think there's anything wrong with that class, but I do think that having an alternative that allows more control over things like sound, things like texture, sensory processing disorders generally, having classes in physical education departments that are more accommodative to specifically sensory processing disorders, like autism, would be cool. Again, nothing wrong with the classes I was in. It was just very difficult because of certain accommodations required for other students made it more difficult for me. It just is how it is sometimes. So I guess what I'm saying is things designed with sensory-based disorders in mind would be cool as well.
Can you imagine faculty being better trained to address the educational needs of autistic college students?
Oh, that'd be cool. Yeah, for sure. I can definitely imagine that. I think I haven't had any negative experiences with professors, but I can imagine that for a professor who doesn't understand certain needs of students, a student having to walk out of class because it's gotten a bit loud might not make sense. And if they had the sort of training to understand, hey, certain students might need that, it's not a dismissal of your class, then it might make it easier for both parties. One of the accommodations I have that I draw a lot and I doodle a lot in class, and that keeps my hands active, and it makes it just infinitely easier for me to sit in say a 4-hour class. I've been in situations in which each of my professors have gone, oh, okay, cool. But I can absolutely see being a professor and seeing a kid doodling and going, well, they're disregarding what I have to say. I don't know why they're here. And if I approach my professors and let them know ahead of time, just in case, there was a misunderstanding. But having I forget the request for accommodation, if it's a form that a professor has. I know you fill out a form, but being able to see that you have a student who's autistic on your roster and seeing them, I don't know, draw on your fidgeting and going, oh, okay, this is probably related to that, and not I'm being dismissed and they're not valuing my material would be helpful. I mean, for some people, I'm sure.
Can also imagine, like, as a professor, creating a lesson plan and thinking about the different kinds of activities and assignments that you want in your class. Like, I think most of us are not taught, right? We're not trained to understand how people on the spectrum might approach those activities in different ways, right? And so how we might accommodate students as we're thinking about the activities that we're assigning, right? Like social, like group activities, group assignments, presentations, that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. There are activities I've experienced in classes that have been absolutely instrumental in the learning experience of my peers, that have been insufferable for me to endure from a sensory perspective. I don't think that those lesson plans should be removed, and I don't think that they should be even necessarily altered, but I think sort of having maybe a plan B, or knowing that, hey, I should give a heads up that we're going to have a very loud class session so that students with sensory processing disorders may know not to show up, may know that there is alternative curriculum for them on Canvas, or there might be a smaller, or maybe instead of having like two big group discussions, what one of my communications professors did was had different groups go to different classrooms so that we could all talk amongst ourselves and still be able to hear and process easily. There are definitely modifications that can be made, and having instruction and training in knowing how to make things more, if not accommodating, then accessible would be probably very helpful.
So is there anything on these topics that we've just been talking about that you want to elaborate on? Anything else you want to add?
Not that I can think of.
Okay, because I have some questions about class.
Sure.
So you already said that your family you describe them as upper middle class.
Mm-hmm.
Would you define your own class status currently as also upper middle class, or how would you define your class status?
So I'm in a situation where I had to move out at about 18. First I moved out at 17, then again, and permanently, hopefully, at 18. And I have been living paycheck to paycheck since. So I wouldn't necessarily ascribe that to upper middle class. I'm also in a situation, though, where when I'm struggling, I can reach out to my parents and they have resources to offer. So I wouldn't categorize myself as like being in poverty, I have resources that others don't in regards to that because my family comes from upper middle class. I am also, however, working a lot and struggling to make rent, I don't really have a clear-cut definition for where I am financially in terms of like the class system. I recognize that my background has led me to a great amount of privilege, but that my current circumstances they can be rough as well.
Do you mind talking about what you do for work?
Sure. Right now I am a removal technician for a mortuary company. I work part-time and I work on call. What that means is that when someone passes away, I receive a call from our dispatcher and I travel to our care center, pick up a company van, and either alone or with a partner, I go take care of someone's loved one after they passed away. we bring them into our care and to wherever they have to go next. What that means in terms of myself financially, though, is that I'm paid on call, which means that if I don't receive any calls, I don't get paid. So while my hours are only from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. most nights, I have worked 16-hour shifts because I can't really afford not to take calls when they come. I have the right to turn down calls outside of my hours, but can I afford to? I love my job a lot. It means a lot that I'm able to do it, that I'm able to, it's an honor to serve families in this way, genuinely. It is a bit difficult, not knowing how much you're going to get paid. I haven't struggled too much with that. I've made rent consistently, which has been nice. Before this, I worked I almost said 24 hours. That would be wild. No, sorry, I worked full-time at a sex shop, actually. And working full-time, 8 hours, 5 days a week in a shop while doing full-time school is not something I can do as an autistic. It is grueling. But I really like my job, and I'm glad that I can keep it.
Do you find it difficult to balance your schoolwork and your job sometimes?
Yes. Yeah, definitely, because I can be working till 6 a.m. and then have class at 9 a.m. And I've got to decide whether or not I'm going to go to class or sleep so that I can work again at 12 p.m. You know? And so it does get a little bit difficult making those calls and deciding how my time is used. I've been pretty good at managing that, I think. I've been fairly successful by my standards in my education. And not at the detriment of my work life. And vice versa as well. I've been pretty solid in my work life. I think I've been fairly successful at what I do. I think I'm pretty good at what I do, and not at the detriment of my education too much. I haven't missed too much class, but I've missed more than I would like to.
Have your professors been accommodating, or have you told them why you have to miss class when you do have to miss class?
They've been accommodating. I haven't had to. The classes that I've had to miss have been classes where attendance isn't as strict as others. Were it to be reversed, I don't know if all of my professors would be as accommodating, since balancing work and school life is something that's kind of an expected skill. I don't know, but my experience thus far has been positive.
So do financial stressors ever make it difficult for you to concentrate on your coursework?
Yes. Yeah, right now I'm actually planning a move to Portland to continue my education, and I am very stressed about that financially. I'm also taking full-time summer school, and my ability to focus on both getting enough sleep and getting enough work on top of the logistics of moving across states has made it a bit difficult to focus on my schoolwork as much as it deserves me to focus on it. I would like to give each of my courses their full due respect, but it's difficult to do so when there are these things being juggled.
So are you out at work?
What was that?
Are you out at work?
Out at work.
Out at work, like out as queer, out as trans, out as...
Yes and no. I've made some friends at work. I've made some queer friends at work. It's been pretty cool. I'm out to some specific people, not to my employers. I have no reason to think that it would become a problem, but I also don't super want to find out. Just because I can't do full-time. I can't work full-time and do full-time school again. And so there are few other jobs, I think, where I can work part-time and still make rent. So anything I can do to jeopardize my current financial situation is not something I'm keen to do.
Do you tend to make friends who are queer as well?
Yeah, mostly. It's just lived experience, you know? When you relate to someone on lived experiences, you're more likely to solidify a relationship with that person.
How about autistic?
Yeah, most of my friends are autistic, or neurodiverse. Just because, similar reasons, I could not connect to almost anyone who wasn't as a kid, and I didn't know why, and now I know why, and I can find a community in that, and not just, not isolation.
So how do you find community? How do you find friends?
I do not hesitate to approach people and talk to them. Like I mentioned earlier, with the being able to confront adults in my childhood easily, or at least more easily than my neurotypical peers, I find similar experience in interpersonal life, where I don't hesitate as much as other people to compliment someone's earrings, you know, and that starts a conversation, and then you exchange social media maybe and talk later. I also think I benefit a lot from being pretty easy to clock as queer.
Have you found community at ARC?
I've made some friends at ARC. Yeah, it's been nice. I have made some pretty good friends at ARC, actually, in my chemistry course. I have met and worked, I guess not worked under, but learned under some professors who I've greatly enjoyed the experiences of learning by, that I look forward to maybe learning under again in the future. I think I'm using that terminology correctly. Being taught by,
Learning under?
mentoring under?
Learning by, learning under. I think it's
Yeah.
either way is fine.
Yeah, you get the idea. So yes, I think I have found community at ARC.
Do you mainly find friends in the classroom, or are you involved in any student groups, or do you go to the Pride Center?
I don't have time to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm mostly in the classroom. I'll have like a work buddy, and then we hang out outside of class, and then either we build a friendship, or we have a professional working relationship, or we don't, and that's cool. I don't really have time to do a lot of extracurricular stuff. I would love to be a part of theater. I have not before, but it's always been something I've been interested in, but that just doesn't work with having to pay for groceries and rent and utilities and stuff, you know? It doesn't, like, the timing doesn't add up.
Do you know about the Los Rios Queer Discord?
I do. I find it difficult to engage on very large scale social media, like group chats, for lack of a better word, just because there's so many people. It feels like everything is in passing, like down a hallway where you can hear some stuff and maybe exchange a brief conversation, but then they're lost to the crowd. I know that that's not everyone's experience, though, and I think that's still a valuable resource for some people. Just not for me.
You mentioned, I think, did you say that you moved out when you were 17 or 18?
Yes. So when I was 17, it was about the middle of the pandemic, and it was pretty rough being stuck indoors. And my family in the Midwest said, "Hey, Allan should visit." And I said, "Allan should visit." And so I lived with my aunt for a little bit in Iowa, and I had enough medical complications that I had to move back. And then when I turned 18, I moved out again. Except instead of moving into family's home, I moved into my own place. I rent around the Sac State area. It's targeted towards students, so it's more affordable. I've always had a couple roommates. The most I've had was there was a total of 4 people and 2 cats in my room.
In your room?
Yes,
room?
Yeah, but we made it. Yeah.
And now, do you have roommates?
Right now, I have, I'm in a situation where it's not student housing, but they still, you rent a bed, and then they put, 4 people in one, living area situation. So we each have our own rooms, but so I've got roommates. I've got 3 roommates. And then I'm moving to Portland with my coworker, actually, my friend Jasper, and his brother. And I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, nice.
I got lucky in that we found an apartment that's like on campus for me.
Wow.
That would be really cool.
Where are you transferring to?
Portland State University.
Portland State University. Okay, so you talked a little bit about what it was like being queer in high school. Is there anything else you want to mention in terms of your experience in high school?
It wasn't all negative. I had a lot of queer friends as well. It was really nice being able to speak up for my peers who were more anxious to. I don't have a whole lot more to say. It was nice. Lori Vine was my mentor, and it was an honor being able to learn and do activist work under her. I worked with the LGBTQ Coalition, as well as the Pride Pack in the San Juan Unified School District, and I'm very glad to have had those experiences. I, to this day, will reach out to Lori.
What did you do for the two groups?
So for Pride Pack, I was a student representative. It was actually mostly a student group that every year would host a large seminar about LGBTQ rights of students and just topics and identities and explaining what they mean. And it was hosted for the benefit of faculty and staff, as well as some parents and families. And then the LGBTQ Coalition was an organization that worked to pass paperwork through the San Juan Unified School District to make being a trans kid easier for people in our school district. I was the only student representative of that group. It was mostly faculty.
So what was the process? How did you make it easier?
Well, we passed some paperwork that the way it works is that if a student comes out to a teacher, a counselor, anyone on campus, they would be able to reference this paperwork that guidelines a conversation, or doesn't necessarily guideline a conversation, but you give this paperwork to a student, or you talk them through it, or you fill it out with them, and it just details, okay, so who can know this, who can't know this, about pronouns, names, different topics like that, usually specifically pertaining to trans identity. Yeah.
So was part of that process allowing students to add their names and add their pronouns to the system and be respected by faculty and staff?
So the way it works is that if the paperwork is being utilized correctly, then there will be a list of where the student's name and pronouns should and should not show up, in accordance to what is safe for them, what is comfortable for them, where they're at in their transition. If they wanted to, then they could have it so that their name and pronouns could be changed throughout the school district's information and records regarding them. But if they wanted it to be in the roll register and not on their email or their student portal, whatever format that might take, then that could be made to be the case as well. Yeah, so it just it eased the transitioning. If not specifically socially, then administratively, I guess, or technically within the school system itself, if that makes sense. It eased the transition of the student making changes, not necessarily in social interaction strictly, but in the technological sort of aspect and the technical aspect of transitioning in education.
So were any of your high school classes queer or trans inclusive in terms of the curriculum, but also the practices?
Yes, actually. A lot of the teachers there did do their best. They were not provided super updated materials, it seemed, but they were committed to doing what they could to be inclusive of queer experiences in their classroom and in their materials. We covered some queer topics in history. We covered queer topics in health, which is pretty cool. And I think that for the most part, at least, there are exceptions. For the most part, the staff was doing their best.
Is there anything you would have liked to be done differently, or topics you would have liked to have seen covered in more depth?
I would like it if, well, let me phrase it this way. As a student, I like the opportunity to learn more about queer topics in whatever field is immediately relevant. Like for history, I very much was looking forward to the opportunity about learning about the Stonewall riots and about queer history in general from our history course. And when the teacher said, hey, maybe you could be a resource for us, it was a little disheartening. Because on one hand, they're wanting to make their material more inclusive and more specific to different experiences, but they don't have the resources to the extent that they're asking a 16-year-old if they can contribute to help them out. It speaks to, I don't know because I'm not a part of the high school education system, it either speaks to a lack of research on their part, or it speaks to a lack of allowed or presented materials that they're able to pull from.
So what did it feel like being asked or being being asked to be a resource for other students or for your teacher in high school?
It was a couple teachers.
Yeah.
It wasn't a strictly bad thing. I do really like the idea of I do and did enjoy being able to be a resource. It felt productive. I was doing something, and I feel like I still am doing things in providing information and modifications and sometimes corrections to materials. I like that I'm able to contribute. I also don't like that I have to contribute. These are not mutually exclusive feelings. And it was frustrating as a kid, but it was something that I understood. And it's not like these teachers were being very well compensated for their research that they did do. Mm-hmm. So I don't really hold any ill will. But I was disappointed learning that I wouldn't actually be learning much about queer history or queer health or whatever else was relevant, queer literature, etc.
Oh yeah, did your classes not go into much depth even when they did cover queer topics?
Oh, no,
yeah,
definitely not. Which, again, to be fair, there was a lot to cover in those courses, and it's often crammed into like a general subject area, like English or history. Mm-hmm. They don't have what we have here at ARC of like human sexuality, the class, But yeah.
Okay, so transitioning to college, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you choose to attend community college?
It's affordable. I romanticized the idea of going to a 4-year right out of high school a lot as a kid, but I also wanted to move out and not be as dependent on my parents. And it is a lot more affordable in California to go to a 2-year and get 2 years of your 4-year or longer education out of the way without paying just crazy amounts of money than it is to go to a 4-year right off the bat. And I don't regret that at all. I've had a pretty great experience at ARC. Yeah.
So what do you love most about being a college student?
I enjoy that I can pick the subjects I'm learning about. That is pretty cool. I like that there is, even in the gen ed, there are options.
So can you talk some about your experience taking courses that either wholly or in part cover queer and trans topics?
Oh, I have yet to have a positive experience with that. I have had those experiences. I have taken some courses that were very difficult to endure because they were very poorly informed. I have had the interaction in my human sexuality class where I had missed the day prior and I showed up to class and the gal next to me, and it's a pretty small class too, only like 15 max kids, adults, people. And I had the experience where I had missed the class prior and I showed up and the gal next to me was like, oh man, the last class was like perfect. You'd be really good at like talking about it. I'd like to have heard what you'd said. And I'm pretty vocal in class when appropriate and respectfully. I will ask engaging questions. I will make corrections when appropriate, all within a good rapport with the professor, nothing disrespectful, but often necessary. And so I responded to this peer with, what was it about? I don't know. I mean, that sounds really interesting. What was the topic? And she said, wow, I mean, I don't know, you'd be really good at explaining it. And it was perfect. Man, you'd be able to talk about it really well. And I said, well, what is it? I mean, I'm so curious now. And she said, I don't know. You weren't there to explain it. And then there were other students who agreed with that sentiment. So that kind of gives you an idea of how queer topics are handled. It's just incredibly stressful having to be a guide for the professor, and having to be respectful in correcting their misinformation.
Mm-hmm. Can you think of other specific examples of like when there's been misinformation or incorrect information provided?
One thing that is not the fault of any specific instructor is that I personally dislike is that queerness and transness are linked in with paraphilic disorders in psychology courses. Things like that just feel very like kicking sand in my face, you know? Things like bestiality and pedophilia and, you know, being gay.
Oh, that's what happened in this human sexuality class, or maybe in another class.
Oh, in human sexuality and in normal psychology, so on and so forth. And it's not that, like, you can't talk about sexuality as a category, but you have to be clear. Mm-hmm. Because there will be students who hear those two things talked about in the same sentence and go, yes, bad. You know, hopefully your class is being taught with more nuance than good and bad in psychology. Hopefully. But that is not always the case. And it's exhausting. Especially as a disabled, a neurodivergent person. Mm-hmm. Being in abnormal psychology courses where there is not very much courtesy lent to those who are not neurotypical. It's a bit rough.
So it sounds like you've taken very few classes that have even touched on queerness or transness, and the manner in which those classes have covered those topics has been problematic, right?
Yes.
Have you had any, positive experiences with queer topics being covered?
No.
So if you could, would you want to take additional courses that focus, you said no.
Well, I haven't had positive experiences yet. Yeah. I'm not open to those never happening.
Yeah.
I look forward to taking similar courses, as this is my area of research. Mm-hmm. At my next college that I'm transferring to, I don't think I will take another psychology course at ARC.
Are you hopeful about when you transfer? Do you think there are some courses that are going to be offered that you feel a little bit more hopeful about?
Hesitantly, yes.
Okay.
I am hopeful because I have to be, because this is my major.
Yeah.
I am hoping that they will be covered better, yes. I look forward to learning about psychology. I hope that it is less heavily stigmatized both in the material and presentation going forward.
Anything else you want to add about your experience with queer and trans topics being covered in your classes? Anything else you can think of?
I think that I've had negative experiences, but that's also, I'm one person, and I am hopeful in that is not representative of a lot of other students outside of, say, my classes that I've been in. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily think these like couple professors I've dealt with have been representative of the entire American River College staff by any means. So while I am very critical, I am also not like damning the whole organization at all. I have worked with queer professors, and it has been refreshing. So actually, yes, I forgot, but I took one course in my freshman year online at ARC that was Women in Literature, and I was able to read the work of some professors pertaining to queer topics. That was very nice. I apologize, I forgot about that. It was very nice. I am glad to have.
How did it feel to come across, like, were you expecting to come across literature or whatever you read that was by or about queerness? By queer people or about queerness?
Well, I was taking a Women in Literature course, and there was, I think it was one option on one assignment that looked kind of queer, so I checked it out, and I really enjoyed the poem, and then the professor reached out to let me know that it was written by a professor of ARC.
Oh.
And that was pretty cool. I think that if I had the opportunity to take a course under them, I would. Or if I had the opportunity to take more courses pertaining to queer topics generally, I would. It's just that I have run out of my free 2 years.
Oh yes, that was my next question. So if you could, would you take additional courses that focus on queer and trans topics?
Not in psychology.
Okay.
Yes, generally.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the humanities, I guess psychology is a humanities course, but social science. Anyways, in the humanities, yes. I think in topics that focus on, I guess, just topics that don't pathologize, you know? Mm-hmm. In fields that don't focus on getting to the root of why and simply explore what is, it would be a lot more enjoyable. I think that there are ways to cover why that are less fetishistic, or perhaps that's not the best word because of the associations it has. I think that there are ways to approach questions of why that are not as dehumanizing than they are currently being handled in certain areas. I think that there are ways to make them approachable and interesting and explorative and still accomplish the question of why does the brain work like this? What is it that makes things different or different, that can be respectful of the fact that they are different.
So you haven't had the opportunity to take Intro to LGBTQ Studies or...
no, I haven't.
Or queer literature?
No.
Which is not offered all the time.
But I would like to.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see what is to offered.
Yeah. So why do you think you haven't had the opportunity to take those?
Because you mentioned that they aren't often offered, or
Mm-hmm.
not always offered, and then I have had a lot of difficulty navigating the class enrollment process. A lot of classes that I was looking for to take, even like before starting ARC, I just wasn't able to get because they either weren't offered or they were offered, and somehow I wasn't able to select it on like the website. Yeah.
So what has been your experience in the classroom, feeling either included or excluded, more generally speaking? You know, around your queerness, your transness, your neuro diversity, anything that you want to talk about?
I think that for the most part, I've had positive experiences. When it comes, I think that for the most part, I've had positive experiences when it comes to my neurodiversity, my queer identity in the classroom setting. It doesn't often come up, and when it does, it's not... I don't feel disrespected regarding it. I have those experiences I've mentioned prior that are outliers. They feel less like outliers, I think, because I've only been at ARC for 2 years, and that is 1 semester out of 4. But I like to think that, generally speaking, my experience reflects positivity and inclusivity in the ARC environment.
Have you had any experiences being misgendered or being around people or, you know, friends with people who have talked about being misgendered?
So that's the funny thing about not being binary. I don't think that I've been maliciously misgendered at all at ARC. I have had friends who have been misgendered, but I don't remember if that was in ARC or a different college, so I can't speak to that specifically. That's the funny thing about being non-binary, though. I don't really see myself as a sir or a young man. But never has anyone said that to me in a way that communicates the same thing as, well, ma'am. You know? It's not that sort of condescension. It's because I present a certain way, and they're reading that the way that they have been socially programmed to. And I can't fault them for that. Unless, of course, I corrected them, and they continued, but that has not happened. That can be faulted for. But that has not been my experience.
Have you had experiences in your classes that have, in which the faculty have consciously or proactively tried to respect people's pronouns?
Yes, yeah, actually. Whenever witnessing a student, a peer, or myself correct a professor or a teacher in my past about pronouns, it has almost always been met with, "Oh, my bad. Okay," which is the right response. And it might also be followed with messing up in the future, but that's okay. It happens to everybody. It's not malicious in my experience or what I've witnessed.
So how do you think faculty, staff, and other students can learn to use the correct pronouns?
Practice. I think all it takes is practice. I think a big part of it too is identifying, especially when it comes to more neutral pronouns, like they, them, when you've used it in the past. I think that reading old books helps because then you can see it used commonly and historically and adjust yourself to it. I think a big part of it is practice.
Have you ever struggled academically while at ARC in any of your classes?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, that's also the part, like, having a learning disability will do that. I started when most classes were online, and I started with STEM courses, and those were hard, and I don't think the professor really knew how to do STEM online, which I imagine was probably not in their job description, so I can't fault them for that too much. But I recall scheduling a meeting with the professor of chemistry where I was going to ask them what I can do to learn their material better, access their material better, and they started our conversation with, "So, Allan, you're one of the better students, the more successful students of my class." And at the time, I had an F. And so we've had rough patches. I've taken chemistry twice and failed both times. I have a friend who failed 3 times before passing, and that seems like with STEM, it's just kind of how it goes. I can't really afford to keep failing STEM classes, though, so I am reserving those for my later education and getting out of the way the things I know are easier, mostly so that I had a good GPA to transfer to a 4-year with, to apply to 4 years with. But yeah, I've struggled. I've received accommodations as well to help with this, and they have. Yeah.
So when you have struggled, why do you think you struggled?
I think that first year, it was a combination of inaccessible material as well as overwork on my part. I was working full-time, and I was in school full-time, and I'd never done that before. I'd also just moved out for the first time, and I'd just been diagnosed with autism, and it was just a lot of new stuff at once, and I wasn't quite ready. I haven't struggled as that much, though. I think I failed maybe 3 classes, 2 being that chemistry course and 1 being a math course, which are just areas I've always struggled in.
Is there anything you think the professors in those courses could have done to help you not fail?
Seek peer review for their website, I think, is a big one. I think making sure that your PowerPoints are not condensed onto like 1 slide would be super cool. Yeah, I mean, some things come down to the accessibility of the material, and some things come down to just that it takes longer for me to learn certain things. With that chemistry course, I think a big thing is just that there was so much information, and it was all condensed into a semester's worth of courses. The first time it was really rough because I don't feel like I was being met halfway by the professor, and the second time I had some of the best professors I've ever taken. Wilson and Eugen, amazing, and I'm glad to have taken their course, and I'd gladly take it again. It was just that there was so much information condensed that I couldn't really work through it effectively to be successful in that class at the time.
So, have you ever used support services for queer and trans students at ARC?
Personally, I don't think that I have. I think they're very valuable and are helping a lot of people. And I've met people who use them. Mm-hmm. I just don't have time to seek out like the conferences or the events or the social interactions, and I don't really know what would be offered that could help me academically that would be pertaining to my queer identity and not my autistic situation.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I don't know if I can say much more just because I'm very unfamiliar with the queer support system at ARC. I do know of it. I have heard about it. I know where it is. I've been in the room. I think that it's not a secret necessarily the same way that disability services tends to feel. But I don't have time to participate in the fun community bringing events, and I don't know what they would have to offer academically that could support me the way that would be relevant to my needs.
So have you felt unsafe, harassed, or uncomfortable when using gender-specific restrooms?
Totally. Oh yeah. I mean, that's another thing with being non-binary. It's the whole, well, I'm wearing a skirt, and I could go to the men's restroom and risk any interaction like that. Or I could go to the women's restroom wearing a beard, you know, and make other people feel uncomfortable. You know, it's just that I will get weird looks regardless. I don't want to make anyone feel unsafe. I also don't want to feel unsafe. And you can't have your cake and eat it too. It's either I go to the men's restroom and I'm wearing a dress that day, because that's what I felt like wearing, that's what's comfortable to wear, and I risk that sort of harassment pertaining to that because of that, my presentation and my appearance in a men's restroom, or I wear that same dress and I go to the women's restroom and I have a beard. And while there's nothing wrong, I think, with that, I do acknowledge that it makes some women very uncomfortable, and I don't want to make people uncomfortable, you know? I don't want to make anyone feel unsafe. And I also would not like to feel unsafe. And that's just not really an option. You can't, again, have your cake and eat it too.
Have you had a hard time finding all-gender bathrooms?
I don't think I've seen one. I also haven't looked that hard because I usually just suck it up and use whichever one is closest. Whichever one, if I'm wearing like a suit, if I'm wearing these pants, I'll probably just use the men's restroom. And that's fine. And if I am not, then I will quickly go to a stall and wait till people are out and then leave, so that I don't run into anyone. Or honestly, at ARC, I've had a lot less issues than I did in like high school. So even if there are people there, I don't feel as uncomfortable in the men's restroom wearing a skirt. I also know that I am a lot more built than I was in middle school. And so if someone were to attack me, I'd feel less insecure in my ability to take care of myself than I did then. It is always something I think about, though, and I think that's kind of messed up that I have to.
Do you sometimes avoid using the bathroom so that you don't have to choose?
No, I don't. I think it is very reasonable that some people do, but I feel relatively safe in my own ability.
Can you remember any specific incidences in which another person has said something to you or looked at you, in a way that made you feel like unwelcome or uncomfortable in the bathroom?
Not at ARC, but you also have to keep in mind that the I'm looking at you and trying to convey something is a bit difficult for me to interpret all the time. So not to my recollection at ARC, but the last time was probably in high school with just people confronting me in the bathroom and being shitty.
So, anything else you'd like to add on that topic? On bathrooms?
Not that I can think of, other than that it's important to have gender neutral options in the bathroom. I think it's important. I do know that ARC specifically has had a lot of graffiti in the bathrooms that is anti-Semitic, anti-trans, anti-black. That I don't know how the school would address that, but I think it should be addressed. I think you could probably find a way, you can think about that, and get it taken care of. Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to add in general? About any of the topics we've covered?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay. And then finally, I guess my last question then is, what makes you excited about being a college student in general? Did I ask you that?
I'm not sure you've asked. I love seeking out knowledge and understanding. I like the idea of learning how the brain works. I have recently, well, not super recently, but fairly recently realized that my brain's a bit different, and I'd like to know how and why and where that comes from, and things of that sort. I really like education. I plan on taking a job as a professor when I can, so that I can continue my academic research and further knowledge in a field that is still very early in development.